Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're connecting in from today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come to another advanced user training session on Crank Software's Storyboard, our UI development tool. So today's topic of discussion is around design states and really how they can really make GUI development easier for you. Before we get started and jump into that, I just want to let you know a couple of things. One, today's session, of course, is being recorded. So that way, if at any point in time you need to drop off, or if maybe you have a colleague that you think would really benefit from today's topic, you can easily come back and listen to it. In fact, actually, we do have the project files located in our Help Center location. So if you want to take the time right now, you can download them and follow along, or you can download them after the fact and follow along with the recording as well. We will be doing Q&A at the end of today's session. So at any point in time, if you do have a question, feel free to submit it into the chat window that you find on your screen. And of course, if you haven't already, feel free to follow us on any of the social media platforms. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And if you ever want to, you can kind of tweet something out of today's session or anything, just, use either a GUI development hashtag or hashtag Crank Software. We're very lucky today to have Mike Marchand, who is a product architect for our Storyboard UI development tool here at Crank Software. He's been with Crank for a while now and has a lot of great information on the ins and outs of different aspects of Storyboard and also within design states. So today we're going to really be I'm going to give you a brief overview of Storyboard, just in case maybe this is the first time you've been exposed to it and you were asked to attend, just to kind of give you a little brief synopsis on Crank Software Storyboard. As well, we're going to be then jumping into design states and talking about how the master context or state context buttons can really help speed up the GUI development process. We'll then kind of be jumping in to find out how design states really make it possible to view work with content that is not typically visible to you. We'll also talk about how it can be utilized to preview animations from a different start state, and how things like animations, design states, and named data changes can all be kind of converted from one and the other. And then, of course, we'll jump into some Q&A. So Storyboard, let's kind of jump into that, just give you that kind of brief synopsis. What really makes Storyboard different is that Storyboard provides a foundation for a streamlined UI development for embedded products that meets both the UI development team needs from both software developers as well as UI designers, as well as the business goals. Really, what makes it different is that the front end UI is decoupled from the back end logic, really allowing for both states to kind of be worked on at the same time, and changes made to, say, the design elements in the front end UI really don't impact the work that's going on. And then we have this well-defined kind of data model with events APIs that really kind of connect and provide that kind of that glue logic in between, really allowing for UI development to really be sped up and really not allow things like hardware changes to kind of keep it crashing down. And what I mean by that is that if any point in time the project changes from maybe a particular board, maybe it's an MCU to an MPU board within a particular vendor's product lines, or maybe going from one silicon vendor to another, it really allows you to kind of retain all the hard work you've done and then marrying up with our back-end runtime engines that have been kind of specifically built and optimized for the different hardware. Once you layer that on, that UI work comes with you. So the most important thing to note there is that we're not really a code generation framework. So really making UI development not reliant on those hardware or coding to really begin the UI design workflow. So you can really begin crafting the UI within typical design programs like Photoshop or Sketch, and really kind of fine-tuning that user experience, and then import those design files into Storyboard, which then become the building blocks for the UI itself, really helping speed up the time it takes to really kind of craft an elegant and exceptional user experience. Also, we provide a variety of different unique features, and one of which I'll call out is the Storyboard's graphical compare and merge tool, which really enables teams to remain in control during UI refinements. Because as we know, it's not a matter of if UI refinements are going to occur. It's a matter of when they are, and definitely if the UI really helps embedded products really stand out from each other in a crowded market space. And so really making sure that the user experience provided by that GUI app really kind of is optimized for the hardware, as well as providing that elegant user experience is really important. That may take multiple rounds of UI refinement. So the great thing about it is Storyboard was really kind of designed with that in mind, and things like that graphical compare and merge tool really help keep you in control of picking and choosing which ones you want to roll forward with. The important thing I want to kind of point out is Crank Software is also a services company. So if you need a prototype developed fast for a proof of concept, with key stakeholders, or maybe you have an idea but not the time or the in-house resources dedicated to produce it, or maybe you're even looking for ways to optimize the performance of the GUI application that you're building, maybe using Storyboard today. No matter what you're trying to do, our team of Storyboard designers and developers are really here to make your life easier for your embedded project. We can help you from start to finish, from planning, implementation, maintenance of your GUI, or maybe placing it through some rigorous testing to uncover any issues that could impact the user performance of your product further down the line. So, keep us in mind that we do have a team of professional services app developers that are really here to make your life easier. The other thing I want to kind of talk about is our help center. So we kind of revamped our help center recently, and if you haven't been there, definitely give it a look. We have a lot of getting started videos, as well as different knowledge-based articles, some of them text, some of them video-based, as well as quick access to downloadable demo images, or things like I was mentioning earlier, the project files for this advanced and all the other advanced user training sessions that we did. You would find those under the downloadable demo images section at the bottom of that page. You'll see the advanced user training. So we also have a community that's there to assist you. So if you have any questions, if you haven't joined, be part of the community, post your questions, get answered by, it could be people that work within Crank Software. It could be other Crank Software developers in the field that's there to kind of really help it out. So definitely, we have a lot more. Check it out. It's a great resource for you to really make your life easier when it comes to developing your GUI app for your embedded project. And so with that being said, I'm going to pass things over to Mike, and he is going to jump into all things related to design states and really making it easier for you to leverage it going forward.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So, like Scott said, my name is Mike. I've been a storyboard developer for 5 years. And over that time, I've kind of learned a lot about the tool, and I often enjoy doing these training sessions to kind of share that knowledge. So what we're going to do here today is we're going to get an introduction to design states, and we're going to get some familiarity with what they offer you as a tool to leverage while working in Storyboard Designer. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to import my application that I've got set aside here. What this app is just our thermostat sample that we include with Storyboard by default, except what I've done is I removed all the design states. So it gives us an opportunity to build up this application to be essentially what our sample is, which includes various design states. So we'll get a little bit of the reasoning behind why we're going to create these design states and how to do that instead of just having a finished application with design states to browse. So we've got this application. It's got 5 screens. I'm going to go ahead and move my weather to just below home since it's the second in the list here. So it's got 5 screens. I'm going to go ahead and simulate the sample. So I'm going to click the simulator button. It's going to launch our engine and it's going to run our sample. We're just going to take a quick tour of the sample itself. So we've got our sample up and running here. A few things to note. So on this home screen, there's an animation, and this brings down this drop-down menu. So you kind of see a little bit already that there's off-screen content, and by default, we can't see it until after that animation runs. So that's one thing to remember. And then as we check out the other screens, we can start seeing some other type of animations, such as this 5-day forecast has a quite fancy animation that moves everything away and brings a whole new set of content on screen. So that's an interesting animation, and we have the reverse version of that animation here as well, which returns us back to our weather. So those are other types of animations. So you can see a bunch of content that's not normally visible that gets shown by these animations. Here we just have some other simple animations, but what's interesting about these 3 animations is they're actually one single animation, and it's being invoked 3 different ways on 3 different controls. So I'll talk a little bit more about how those context-based animations work as we take a look at those as well. This screen doesn't have too much interesting for us, but this one does. So on this screen, we've got things such as these buttons, which change our background images. And we've got the language changes as well, but we're not so much going to touch on the language changes in today's discussion. And we've got another one of these animations here. So that's just a quick tour of the sample, just kind of familiarizing ourselves with what we're working with. So with that quick tour, you can kind of see that from our initial design point of view here, we don't have access to everything that's visible while we're running the application. For example, the off-screen content in the dropdown or on our weather screen, we can't see the 5-day forecast that shows up. And in fact, even on the layer itself, we can't see those pieces because they're all being hidden and they're all bunched behind this layer here. So their initial state is actually tucked behind another control. So we're going to be able to use design states to kind of make that better. And yeah, so some other things would be like those background images, kind of we don't have at design time, we don't have a way of seeing what that looks like without running our application. So those are types of things that we will be able to leverage design states for. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to add a new design state, and I'm going to do I'm creating a design state that's going to signify what it looks like when this this dropdown has been lowered. So I'm going to right click on our screen here. I'm going to say add a design state, and I'm going to just call this info down. So this is our info button demo. And if we look here in our animation timeline, we have 6 animations, and one of these is called info. And if I were to preview that animation, we can see that that's the animation that's responsible for taking us from the initial state of the demo control to the lowered state where the additional text is visible. So simply put, what we can do is if we select our design state up at the top here, the screen level, we can see in our properties view that we have these 2 buttons here. One is to add an animation, and one is to add a variable change. So simply, we can add an animation to our design state, and that animation can be the info animation. So what a design state does when it comes to animations is it basically collapses all the steps into an instantaneous change. So even very complex animations will be simplified down to that one frame. And so that's what we get here after. So that animation essentially runs, and this is what it would look like after it runs. So that's great. It just gives us the ability to do things like work with the content that was off screen by default. So if we look here, we've got two render extensions. We've got two render extensions here. We've got embedded software UI solutions, which is that line of text, and we've got this line of text here. And if we wanted to change that text, we'd be able to do that with the master context. So if we switch to master context, rather than changing the design state itself, we'll be changing the real content. So if I were to change this from Crank Software to Crank Software 2020, for example, small change, what happens over here is if we were to lower it down, you'd see that that's applied on the real version of that control. Now the difference is if we were to use our state context, rather than changing the real version, it would only be represented in the design state. Now in this case, we don't want to change that since it's text that's not going to be variable. So that text isn't going to change at runtime ever in our sample. So we won't be changing that in a design state, but we will demonstrate that in another one. So let's move on to our weather screen. So this is the one with that show 5-day animation. And once again, we can preview that animation here in our animation timeline. We can choose the show 5-day animation, and we can say preview animation. This is the same way that it looks when it runs on a target or in the simulator. And we can do the same thing like we did before, where we create a new design state and specify the animation. Or what we can do is, since we're already in the animation timeline, we can right-click Show 5-day. We can say Convert to a design state. And what this does is very simply just creates a design state. Oops, this is my apologies. I created it on the wrong screen. Since the animation itself isn't tied to a screen, I do need to specify that screen when I convert to. So I'm going to say Convert to design state. And I'm going to specify the weather screen because that's where I'd like my design state to be applied. Excellent. So you can see here on the left, we've got our standard weather information. And on the right side, we have our 5-day forecast. So if we look at our design state here, it's just like before where we added an animation, but that single animation is the show 5-day animation. So here you can see quite powerfully that we have all this content that we can work with now, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, that was not visible before since it was obstructed. So we could have done that by manually moving them, or in our case, we specified an animation, which allowed us to also have access to that. Great. So some really good things about this. Design states can be used as the starting point for an animation, which is very important since we were able to preview our show 5-day animation. But what happens if we wanted to preview our hide Monday to Friday animation, which is the reverse version? Well, you see, we can't preview it from the initial state, the main state, since its starting point is the same as its ending point, if you consider its starting to be the master state. So what we can do is we can specify a different starting state so that our start and end can be different. Now watch. If we double click hide Monday to Friday, we can set a design context. So we choose design context and more model elements. So from here, we can choose the weather screen, design state show 5-day. So we're saying start the animation from this state instead, which will, it's going to ask us if we want to apply the context. We can say no, because we do not need to apply it to the steps, which is a process which changes these keys in the animation. Since they're all fully qualified, we don't need to worry about that. So we're going to start from the show 5-day state. So now when we preview this animation, we can actually have it begin where we have the 5 days visible. So when we run hide Monday to Friday, we can actually preview it. So that's a very strong tool, because when you're building animations, you really don't want to have to run your engine and set up all the steps to get to the point where you can actually preview that animation with your simulator. Of course, you want to do that, but it's much more efficient if you can do these quick cycles within the design tool without having to change contexts into the simulator. So, so choosing an appropriate starting point for an animation is quite powerful. So the next thing I'd like to move on to is talking a little about context-based animations. So context-based animations are very powerful, and what they are is, if we were to check out our slider on, so what a context-based animation is it uses special keys. Instead of being fully qualified, they're relative keys. So relative to the control, we have a variable called x off. So it doesn't matter which control it is until it's triggered. If you when you trigger the animation, we specify which control we should use for context. So if we look at CB toggle control, this Lua function here, you can see that when we call animation trigger, we do so with a table, and that table contains a context variable. So here we get to specify that the control that was clicked, so as we press this, since it triggers a press event, as we press, we call that Lua function, and we take the control that was pressed, and it becomes the context for the animation that we're about to trigger. So if we look at our timeline, we take the variable x off and we change it to an x offset of 62. And in reverse, we do the same thing based on relative to the control. We take x offset and we return it back to 0. So what this means is we can still use this in design states. So if we wanted to add a new design state, just like we did before, and we can call this one, we're going to turn this middle one on. So let's call it fan on. So if we were to specify an animation argument like before, and we were to choose slider on, you notice that nothing changes here, because that animation does require additional context, but we can give it to it. Just like we did with the design context here, what we can do, actually, this is a great place to demonstrate it since we've already done it once. This isn't really new. So what we can do is more model elements, and we can specify on the fan screen which one we want. So if we were to type in slider to filter, we can see AC, fan, and timer. So we can choose the fan control, which will allow us to preview it in the tool as well. So similar to before, where we chose a starting state, we can do more than just choose the starting state, but we can choose the actual model object that is supposed to drive the resolution of variables. So in this case, control gets resolved to the fan slider, and that's why we can preview it. So the exact same thing happens in design states, where we can choose the animation argument here, and we can choose a context for that animation. So just like earlier, I'm going to filter slider, and I can choose slider fan control. And you'll see as soon as I hit OK that our slider is now in the on position. So yeah, that's kind of gives you a little bit of extra context for resolving those variables that's required. So that is a very powerful tool as well in and outside of design states. Building animations that are context-based is great, since if we wanted fully qualified names, we would need 3 different animations. We would need an animation very specific to the AC slider, to the fan slider, and to the timer slider. But since we have this context-based one, we can use it anywhere. Any control with an X off will behave as we expect. Great, so that's that. The context-based animations and how we can use that in design states. Interestingly enough, we could also add the slider off. After running slider on, we could choose to run slider off as well. And it's going to be very uninteresting because it's going to return us to our initial off state. But what else is neat about it is these arguments can be reordered. So I can click here and I could say move up. So if we do off before we do on, then we finish in the on position. So sorting these can be important because animations may have maybe operating on the same steps, and at that point, the order does matter, of course. Excellent. So this takes us down. We don't really have anything, I don't off the top of my head have anything to do with the filter screen. The settings screen though, I do have a plan for this. So I'd like to demonstrate working with the variables directly in the properties view. So what we can do is add a design state. And let's call this one metal 1, since we have 2 backgrounds. We have 3 backgrounds. We have metal 1, metal 2, and wood. So let's just call our design state metal 1. So from the properties view, what we can do is we can work with our controls directly. So since we're in state context, my changes are only going to be applied to my state. So if I were to change the value of this image variable to background metal 1, it's applied to just my design state. Whereas if I was in master context and I switched it to metal 2, it will be applied to the master context only. You'll notice that my state didn't change, and that's because what happens is the master changed, but my state is it makes its change after. So it's always relative from the master. So it was metal 2, but then our state says we're setting it to metal 1. So that's kind of the concept of the master and context state. So just because you're changing something doesn't mean it always applies into your state if it's also changing it later on. So that's quite powerful there. What else we're going to do? So I'm going to leave our wood background by default. And we're going to switch back to our state context here. Actually, let's even switch to a master context. So I kind of am noticing that the background or this text doesn't really have the right pop. I kind of feel like it would be better and beneficial if this was a white text during this background. So what we can do is we can select all these texts. So I did a multi-selection, which happens with the control button. So I use control, I selected these 6 text boxes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind them to a variable so that they'll all reference one variable. And let's call that variable text color. I already have one called text color because I may have accidentally created it beforehand and not deleted it. But it's currently unused, so that's great. So we will use that. So we have a variable text color. Excellent. So but you'll notice it changed on the master as well, and that's because the variable itself was always white. So we can go ahead and initialize it as black instead of white. So the variable itself was a white. We bound it to those 6 text fields and they became white. But let's change the variable to black. So what we could do now is we can preview the white text in just our design state. By switching back to state context, we can now change the value of text color, and it's going to be applied to just the state. So if I switch back over here, it'll be black, but in our state, it's going to be white. So some things about that. So if we look now at our design state, we can see a little bit more of a breakdown. There's two variables being changed at this point. We've got the background color being changed, or sorry, the background image being changed, and we have the text color being changed. So what we can do is we can right-click that, and what we can do is we can convert it to a data change. So we can create ourselves a named data change. Let's go ahead and just keep it called Metal1. So here we've created a named data change that contains those 2 changes, just like we had in our design state. And what we can do now is if we look at our settings screen, when we choose the Metal1 button, there's four events on this control, 4 actions. One's on outbound, there's 2 on press, and 1 on release. So on outbound, here, let's start with press. On press, we change the background. We also change our little button here to a down version. So it actually looks a little bit depressed while it's pressed, and then when we release it, it comes back to its initial state. So on press, we set it to Metal1 down, and on outbound, Metal1 up, and same with the release. So what I would like to do is actually change instead of calling a data change, what we can do is we can call an animation. We can switch our data change from being specified a single argument like this to we can use our named data change now. Since we have a Metal1 data change, we can use it instead. And I can actually remove this argument now since it's no longer required since it's already specified up there. So this gives us a version of our data change which will change the text and the background image. So now when we simulate it, we can actually validate that when we click the Metal1 button, our text switches to white, as well as the background changing. So going to our settings screen, and I'm going to click Metal1, you notice our text changes to white, our background changes, everything's visible, popping, looks great. So we want to do the same thing for our Metal2 and our wood. So I think for Metal2, we'll also go with the white text, but when we go back to wood, we need to return that text to black. So we can quite simply add 2 more design states and follow that same process. So adding a design state for our wood, and then we can specify a variable change argument. So this is just another way of adding it manually instead of using the properties. We're changing 2 things, text color, and we're changing the background image from the wood metal layer. So I have added 2 variables here, and when I hit finish, they'll both show up in our list. So our text color on wood goes back to black, and our image goes to BG wood. So there we have that other design state. Really, it's very similar to the initial state, but it doesn't matter where you are. So if you currently have Metal1 state, once you go to the transition of the wood screen, you'll return back to the black text and the wood background. So we can do the same thing that we did before where we right click and we did a convert to a a data change. And we'll just call this one wood. So now what we can do is over here, the same concept as before, we can remove our variable and we can add a wood name data change. And that will allow us to get the background color and the text. And do the same thing for our metal 1 to add another design state for metal 2. And in this case, I started off copying the metal 1. So you'll notice that it already has all the same arguments as the metal 1 design state. So what that means is we can just quickly change it to metal 2, and now it represents the metal 2 design state. And we can do the same thing, convert this one to a name data change as well, and we'll call it metal 2. And it can also be called from our So when we simulate here, we can check that going to metal 1 switches to white text, black text when we go back to thermostat and to the wood screen, and yeah, so we get the expected behavior there. So what we've done is basically just made some small changes using design states that really allow us to see things differently without running our application. So without running a preview, without simulating anything, we can see so much more content than we could before. And we can work with it as well using the master context. Or if we just want to change how we're previewing things, we can use that state context. So there's a couple more little things that are worth mentioning here. So interesting is that design states are, as much as they appear to be screens in the tooling, because they are very similar to a screen, it's that they're based on screens, but they're really just a collection of changes on top of a screen. So what that means is we can copy this metal 1 design state. It can be copied and it can be pasted on other screens. And you'd notice that the same background is going to be visible there. So we're just taking that collection of changes, changing the background image, the text color, and we can apply that to any screen. So there's definitely some advantages to being able to do that as well. That way, that same state can be previewed on any one of the screens that we have there. Yeah. So those were the main talking points that I had for design states and how they can be used to enrich the experience that's the non-simulated, the non-animated experience, that working with stuff that just can't be seen by default, such as our dropdown or our 5-day animation. It's very, very useful to be able to see these elements when they are normally obstructed. Yeah, that's everything I wanted to talk about. Is there any, does anybody have any questions?
So Mike, so just a couple slides left to wrap up, and then I'll jump right into the questions.
Oh, okay, great. So back to you.
Perfect. So just to wrap it up before we jump into the Q&A section, just some key takeaways for today. Like I mentioned, that if you haven't checked out Crank Software's Help Center, definitely kind of head over there today. A large wealth of information as to such as design states or other things from getting started to more advanced topics can all be found there. Also, like I said, at any point in time that if you have questions, comments, feel free to reach out to me for comments that you have on the product, or you really want to leverage our expertise for your next GUI project. Don't hesitate to reach out to us today. So with that being said, now is the time we're going to jump into the Q&A. So you've got a couple of minutes. There's some that's still in there, but if you have any questions, feel free to submit them right now. So Mike, I do have some questions that have been submitted. The first one is, how can we transition to design states in a running application?
Great. Yeah. So that's a great question. So that's kind of like that flow where we were. So I'll step back. So design states are really, it's in the name, that they're purely really for design design time. So they're a tool to enrich the experience in the tooling during design time only. So there's certain ways that we can still roll these behaviors into the engine. And that's kind of what we did when we created named data changes, or when we run animations. So really, the answer to that question is that design states are not to be triggered at runtime, but they're a representation of the things that can be triggered at runtime. So for example, you can trigger animations, you can trigger named data changes, and you can trigger just data changes like set values. So design states are just a representation of a collection of those changes. So you can build up multiple animations in a design state. And so the way that you would end up in that state in runtime is to run multiple animations. For example, if we wanted to run the slider on multiple controls, we certainly can. And we can add multiple animations, multiple data changes. And so at runtime, you would do those multiple animations and multiple data changes. So really, like I said, they're just a collection of the things you can already do at runtime. Yeah, good question.
Perfect. I have another one as well. Could you please go over the master context button again?
Sure. Okay, what's a good example? So if we think about master and context, this button really what it signifies is the differences on where these changes are going to be applied. So since I'm working over here in our home screen state, sorry, our info down state on our home screen here, the changes that I make in state context are only going to be applied to my design state. So if I keep both of these in view here, my master and my state, we can see if I were to change my width here for this control, it'll only change in the design state since we're in context mode. So that's very important. You'll notice the master is not growing. And you'll notice as soon as I changed this value, that our label changed to green, and it all of a sudden became decorated with the design state logo icon. And if we right click on that, we can actually remove it from the design state altogether, and that argument will just vanish. So when we hit OK, it returns us back to the master value. So the difference is if we were on master context button, if our button was set to master context, that means changing the width isn't going to just change our design state. It's going to change the master. And that change may be propagated to the design state, or certainly will be propagated to the design state. And then other arguments in the design state have an opportunity to also change that value. So we'll see here if we're on master context and I change my width, that's going to change on the main and on my design state. And the other thing to point out, and we've already kind of talked about it, is if I say did have it changed in my state, so if I did have it bigger, and then I switch to master, my changes will still affect the master, but we won't notice them in the design state because we're going to be overriding that value in our design state. So yeah, that's really so it's the difference of making essentially changes that are only for a visual changes for in the design state itself, or they're making real changes that when you hit simulate, those changes will make it all the way down to the engine, since you're changing your actual model. Yeah, good question. I hope that answers your question.
All right, so another one here. How does the memory usage of using design state versus other methods, example, Lewis script, compare? And then it seems like design is creating an extra screen.
That's a great question. So that's, yeah, so design states are extremely lightweight, especially because they don't actually run on the engine. They really are limited to just in the design tool. And since they're not a copy of a screen, they're really just a couple, like a collection of the few changes that are made on top of that screen. So your model actually isn't being grown when you have design states. So really there's trade-offs. It's less about the memory. It's more about kind of the implications that it has in your design time. So you may find that your application itself is better split up into multiple screens, like we have here, where we have 5 screens and they're distinct from one another. And that's really the key thing about screens is you want them to be distinct from one another. But if they are if they are fairly similar, maybe that's an opportunity to use design states, since you will have fewer screens to maintain. So you can just keep the small collection of changes between the states, instead of having screens that only have small differences from one another. Because that's the big difference is if your screens are very similar to one another and have small differences and functionally behave the same at runtime, they just vary from the small collection of changes, an animation having run, or values being slightly different and positioned in different places. um, it's almost likely that a design state would be the better approach, since it's so lightweight and it has zero memory costs in the engine while running. So yeah, so like I said, it really comes down to the how similar your screens are. So the similarity of your screens and how distinct they are from one another. So the more distinct they are, the better candidate they are for being screens. But the more similar they are and the more their behavior overlaps, perhaps a better candidate for being a design state. And I hope that answers that question.
Perfect, thanks, Mike. So we have another one. Is a named data change essentially just an instantaneous animation? It seems that creating one made it appear in the animation timeline.
That's a good question. Yes, yes, it actually is. And so, yes, in its earliest days, they were indeed simple animations with instantaneous time, so no real duration. And we've kind of, they've grown into it where they are now. which is still in animations under the covers, but we have kind of like a veneer on top, which allows you to interact with them in the exact same way as any other data change, which is a little bit more of a simplistic user interface, easier to kind of wrap your head around. So yes, they are very much like an animation. In fact, from Lua, when you say gre.animation trigger, you can specify the name of a named data change, and you'll get that behavior as well.
Perfect. And one last one, unless anybody else has the others, now's your chance to pose it. Should I be using more design states and fewer screens in my GUI application?
Yeah, so that kind of is similar to the other question, where it's like kind of like the trade-offs between design states and screens, where really, like I was saying, it really depends on kind of the state of the screen and the behavior itself, and that those should really be the defining factors. Um, so design states are great for representing the visuals, whereas screens can be better for representing behavioral differences and when things are so distinct that they belong in their own kind of organizational unit, that's where screens are great since they can really provide that model structure that you're looking for. Um, yeah, I certainly lean towards um, using screens for what they are because they are great building blocks, and then using design states to kind of just show the small shifts, taking that building block and looking at it maybe slightly differently. Yeah, good question.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. And while we wrap things up, if anybody has any questions, I'll keep an eye on the question panel here. But before we all go, I just want to thank everybody again for taking time out of your busy day. Oh, one did come in. Let's see here. It is, can you show how to create an animation from the design state, or how one would use a design state to create an animation versus a named data change?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, definitely. So trying to think of a good example that I can show. So I've got one in mind. Um, it let's see. Um, Trying to think of a fun one. Um, so for example, if I'll try to make this one quickly enough, but I'll come up with a simple um, use case here. So let's go ahead and create a new design state from our fan screen. I'm going to do something. So I'm going to grow each of these buttons. Or like these icons, they're just going to grow a bit bigger. So we're going to have to flip scale image on. And I'm going to switch to master context because I want that to be applied across the board. Instead of creating a variable and only changing it in my design state. So I'm going to use this little button here, which is the center alignment button. So when I change my width and my height, my X and my Y will adjust accordingly to keep me in the same visual positioning. I'm just going to grow. Sure. I'll do the same thing here. And I'll do it over here. Oh, goodness, I'm in master. Sorry, I'm going to undo all my changes. My apologies. I was in master context. So those were real changes. We don't want real changes here. So I'm going to flip back to state context. My apologies. We'll do that again. So center, center. So you can see here, X, Y, width, and height have become design state values. Go. There we go. So now we've got a design state. If we look here, it's going to have 12 data changes to it. And that appears to be more than 12 data changes. That's okay. It will still, that actually is interesting. Sometimes when you improvise. So we've got a design state with all these changes. What we can do is we can right click, we can say edit, convert to an animation, and we'll call it grow. And what that'll do is it's going to create an animation that has those changes that we're looking for. And we should be able to hit preview, and we can see that run the animation. So that's just an example of how you can create an animation from a design state. So in a way it's similar to if you're used to the animation recording tool, where we would start a recording, we would essentially grow these three controls and then stop that recording, and it would produce essentially an animation like this. That's if we did them all in a single step, that is. And so the animation recording tool certainly has a lot more capability, since you can break it into multiple steps along the way. But if this was our end state and this was our beginning state, this was our beginning state, that's how that design state can be converted into an animation, just like that.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. As I was saying, is that thank you for taking time out of your day today to come listen to us to talk about design states and storyboard. Definitely, we provide these advanced user trainings around the end of the month, so stay tuned. The next one should be posted onto our website shortly, and you should probably get an email about that or learn about it within our monthly newsletter. So thank you once again, and we look forward to hosting you again in the near future. Have a great day.
Cheers.